The following conversation never actually happened. It is a work of creative fiction featuring AI-generated voices. Please enjoy it as a thought experiment, not as a factual historical account.
This is the Time Capsule Lounge.
Wow. Most peculiar. I've never encountered a room quite like this before.
Looking for the exit, Professor? I've been searching myself. Not that I'm in any hurry to leave such comfortable surroundings.
I was merely observing that the architectural principles at work here seem to defy conventional Euclidean geometry. The dimensions appear fluid.
Trust a philosopher to make even a room complicated. Me? I've stopped questioning it. I just find it strange that neither of us remembers arriving, yet here we sit, having a perfectly pleasant time.
Indeed. And despite the unusual circumstances, I found the setting quite stimulating, and the refreshments to be more than satisfactory.
On that we can agree. Whatever this establishment is, they keep excellent spirits, better than most riverboat bars I've known. Though I imagine you German philosophers would find our American democracy as unstructured as this mysterious lounge.
I'll have you know, sir, that I greatly admired the ideals of the American experiment, though I would indeed have advised a more rigorous philosophical foundation.
Oh, don't mind my teasing. It's a habit I picked up along the river. But speaking of where we are, by all rational principles we shouldn't even be able to converse, given that I recall quite clearly dying in 1910, and you being from a considerably earlier era.
Yes, a most perplexing situation. I passed away in 1804, which would make our conversation temporally impossible according to all known laws of nature. Perhaps this is some form of transcendental illusion or post-mortal hallucination.
Don't let a little thing like death get in the way of a good conversation. I've always thought there are two important days in a person's life, when you're born and when you figure out why. Though being summoned with a fellow who died a century before me might just count as a third.
What's this? Some form of instruction?
Well, Seems our host wants us to introduce ourselves proper-like, even though we've already been jawing at each other for a spell. Please introduce yourselves to our listeners. Listeners, are we being overheard?
Most peculiar. So we engage in discourse without the physical presence of our audience?
Appears to be.
Like a public lecture where the listeners remain unseen, or a treatise addressed to future scholars? An intriguing proposition. Very well. If reason demands, we follow this protocol.
After you, Professor.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, my most honored ladies and gentlemen, I am Immanuel Kant, born in 1724 in the city of Königsberg, Prussia, where I remained my entire life. I served as professor of logic and metaphysics at our esteemed university, and devoted my existence to understanding the fundamental structures of human reason and morality. My works include the Critique of Pure Reason, in which I sought to determine the limits and scope of human knowledge, and the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, wherein I developed the categorical imperative as the supreme principle of morality.
Well, since we're being formal about it, howdy there, invisible listeners from the present. Mark Twain here. Born Samuel Langhorne Clemens in 1835 when Halley's Comet was passing overhead. Lived quite a few places, Missouri, Nevada, Connecticut. Been a printer's apprentice, a riverboat pilot, a silver miner, a journalist, and eventually took to writing books and giving lectures. Wrote some tales the modern listeners hopefully heard of. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and a fair number of stories that raised eyebrows in polite company. Died in 1910 when that same comet came back around, just as I predicted.
You predicted your own death by celestial alignment. Most extraordinary.
I simply said I came in with Halley's Comet and expected to go out with it too. And so I did, though I didn't expect to end up here, wherever here is, having a chat with a German philosopher who died over 100 years before me.
The convergence of our different eras in this peculiar locale does present fascinating philosophical questions about time and existence.
And there he goes with the deep thinking. You know, Professor, I've met men who'd ponder the meaning of a raindrop while standing in a downpour and getting soaked. Sometimes it's best to just accept the strange circumstances we find ourselves in.
Perhaps, though curiosity about one's circumstances seems only natural. But you're right. We have matters of substance to discuss rather than merely speculating about our situation. So, I understand you are quite the traveller, Mr. Twain. While I myself never ventured beyond the vicinity of Königsberg, you explored much of your young nation and even travelled abroad.
That I did. Sailed the mighty Mississippi from top to bottom as a riverboat pilot. Best days of my life, I sometimes think. Crossed the American frontier when it was still wild, ventured to the silver mines of Nevada, voyaged to Europe, the Holy Land, India, Australia. You know, Professor Kant, I've found nothing broadens the mind quite like seeing how folks live differently across the world. Clears away prejudices and narrow thinking faster than any book learning. No offense, Professor, but didn't you feel your world was a bit small?
Not at all. The physical dimensions of one's surroundings have little bearing on the scope of one's mind. You know, through the faculty of reason, I explored the very foundations of human knowledge and morality, journeys as vast as any physical expedition. One need not see the stars to chart their movements, as Copernicus demonstrated.
Well, even Copernicus relied on generations of astronomers' observations, and his calculations weren't the most precise. Isn't some understanding impossible without first stepping onto the river?
I do not deny the value of empirical observation, Mr. Twain. Indeed, our knowledge begins with experience. However, not all knowledge arises from experience. The mind itself imposes structure upon our perceptions.
Well, speak of the devil. Look at that. A map of the old Mississippi. Though this is far more precise than anything we had in my day. But let me tell you, Professor Kant, no map can ever capture the real thing. The way the light plays on the water at dawn, the feeling when the fog rolls in so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face, the sound of the paddle wheel churning.
An impressive waterway, certainly. The scale is quite remarkable. I understand it divides much of your continent. But I would argue that physical experience, while valuable, is merely the raw material of knowledge. It is only through the organizing principles of the mind, what I call the categories of understanding, that experience becomes meaningful.
That's a mighty fancy way of saying you think too much, Professor. Some things you just have to feel. When you're navigating that river, you develop what we pilots called the feel of the water. You learn to read the surface, to know what's happening underneath by the faintest ripple or discoloration. No book learning can give you that.
Yet you yourself became an author, Mr. Twain. As I understood, you extensively translated your experiences into words for others who had never seen the Mississippi. Does that not suggest that experience can be communicated through reason and language?
Well, now that's a fair point. I did try to put the river into words, but I always knew the words were just shadows of the real thing. See this bend here near Hannibal? I could write 1,000 pages about it and still not capture what it feels like to round it at sunset with the light turning the water to gold. Though I suspect you'd say that even my direct experiences were just shadows of some deeper reality. Or am I?
Precisely. What you experienced directly, what I call phenomena, are shaped by the structures of your mind. Behind them lies the noumena, things as they are in themselves, which we can never directly access. Your experiences of the river, vibrant as they were still filtered through human faculties of perception.
So you're saying even when I was on the river, I wasn't really experiencing the river as it truly is, that it was all just some version filtered through my mind?
Not quite. I'm saying that your experience of the river was real, but it was inevitably shaped by your human faculties of perception. The river as it exists, independent of any observer, we can never fully know.
Interesting theory, Professor. But seems to me that's like writing a book about swimming without ever getting wet.
Haha. The principles of human understanding are universal, Mr. Twain. They function the same whether observing a church in Königsberg or the Mississippi River. The environment changes, but the mind's operations remain constant.
So instead of traveling the world to test your theories, you just walk the same route at the same time every day?
Assuredly. The same route, every day, at precisely the same time.
Ah, yes. I heard that folks in Königsberg were setting their clocks by your afternoon strolls. There goes Kant, they'd say. It must be 3:30.
Indeed, I found that a regular schedule fostered clarity of thought. My daily walks at precisely 3:30 provided the perfect opportunity for contemplation, free from distraction. Consistency in habits produces consistency in thinking.
You know, that's where we differ fundamentally. A river changes every day, never the same twice. A sandbar that wasn't there yesterday appears today. What worked yesterday might sink you today. Makes me wonder if your unchanging routines might have, well, limited your thinking somewhat.
On the contrary, by eliminating the variables of everyday life, I created the perfect conditions for pure reason to operate. Would Copernicus have formulated his theories if he were constantly distracted by new landscapes? Newton by changing routines?
Probably not.
The greatest discoveries occur when the mind is properly focused.
But Columbus might not have bumped into America if he'd stayed home philosophizing, and I wouldn't have written a word worth reading if I'd stayed in one place my whole life.
Different pursuits may require different approaches, I grant you, but I maintain that philosophical inquiry benefits from stability and routine.
Still, didn't you never feel a desire to see the ocean, the mountains, to verify through experience what you knew only through books?
I did often contemplate such natural wonders. Indeed, I lectured on physical geography, despite never having seen many of the features I described. My contemplation did not require direct observation, merely a consistent environment for thought.
So nothing in your surroundings could ever change?
Yes. Well, there was actually one incident. A neighbor's tree grew to block my view of the church tower that I had long used as a focal point for contemplation. I was quite distraught until he kindly agreed to trim the branches.
You got in a lather over a tree blocking your view of a building, but never thought to go see the Alps or the Atlantic? Professor, I don't know whether to find that tragic or hilarious.
I found sufficient wonder in the orderly workings of the human mind. The vast landscapes of reason provided all the exploration I required.
The landscapes of reason. While I was battling river currents and desert heat, you were navigating abstract concepts from your armchair.
Our approaches differ, yet both seek truth in their own way. Though I must say, truth itself has always been my guiding principle, in thought and in action.
Truth, you say? Now there's a slippery concept.
Not at all slippery, Mr. Twain. I have devoted considerable thought to the moral dimensions of honesty. I have concluded that there can be no exceptions to the duty of truthfulness. Lying, for instance, it is wrong under all circumstances, regardless of consequences.
Well, Professor, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but you've just sunk about half the steamboats on the Mississippi with that theory. Ain't a pilot alive who hasn't stretched the truth when the occasion called for it. Oh, yes, the channel's perfectly safe, even when you know there might be a snag hiding under the water.
Well, the moral law admits no exceptions, Mr. Twain. To lie violates the categorical imperative. It means acting in a way that cannot be universalized without contradiction. If everyone lied whenever convenient, the very practice of communication would collapse.
Well, look at this. My Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Strange to see it in such a futuristic binding.
A book of yours?
Sure as shooting. I've heard this little novel of mine has caused quite a stir over the years.
How so?
Well, in my time some found it scandalous for its coarse language and irreverent tone. But I understand that later on it stirred up even more controversy over my use of certain racial terms, words that were common in the era I was depicting but rightfully considered offensive today, though I was actually trying to expose the absurdity of those prejudices, not endorse them. The strongest anti-slavery message sometimes requires showing slavery's ugliness honestly. You know, Professor, there's a specific part in this book that raises an interesting moral question, and I'd like your thoughts on.
And what aspect of your work did you wish to discuss?
Now then, it's about a boy named Huckleberry Finn who's floating down the Mississippi with a runaway slave named Jim. See, Huck's been raised to believe helping slaves escape is stealing and a terrible sin. In this scene, Huck decides to help his friend Jim escape slavery, even though he believes he'll go to hell for it. He wrestles with his conscience and then decides, all right then, I'll go to hell. He chooses to do what he thinks is wrong rather than betray his friend. What does your moral law have to say about that?
An interesting moral dilemma. But the question rests on a flawed premise. Helping an enslaved person to freedom is not immoral. In fact, treating any person as merely a means, rather than an end in themselves, violates the categorical imperative. The institution of slavery itself is what contradicts moral law as it uses humans as mere tools.
Well, I'll give you credit there. That's more progressive thinking than many folks in my time managed. But what about when Huck lies to protect Jim? Is that still absolutely wrong?
Yes, even then. One must not commit a wrong, even to prevent another wrong. If we allow exceptions to moral principles based on consequences, we undermine the very foundation of morality.
That's where you lose me, Professor. I've seen too much of the world to believe in absolutes. Sometimes a lie is the only decent option. And between you and me, I've always thought truth is too precious to waste on folks who aren't worthy of hearing it.
But that's precisely the problem with consequence-based morality. Who decides who is worthy of truth? By what criteria? Such thinking makes morality entirely subjective and undermines its universal nature.
Let me ask you this, Kant. Say there's a murderer at your door asking where your friend is hiding, and you know your friend is inside. According to your principle, you must tell the truth?
This is a common objection to my position. But yes, one must not lie, even in such circumstances. However, I would not be obligated to answer at all, or I might find other truthful ways to protect my friend without resorting to falsehood.
That sounds like splitting hairs to me. Sometimes the rigid truth does more harm than good. You know, I wrote something in my autobiography about how when you're in doubt, just tell the truth. And I mentioned that this advice would astonish people, even though telling the truth is actually the easiest thing in the world.
I don't understand. If truth-telling is easy, why would it astonish people?
Because so few folks actually do it. That's the joke, Professor. People tie themselves in knots with lies when the truth would be simpler. But that doesn't mean the truth is always right. Sometimes compassion matters more than accuracy.
The right action is not determined by what is easy, Mr. Twain, nor by compassion alone, but by what aligns with moral law. While I do not deny the importance of compassion, it must be guided by rational principles.
You know, Professor, I respect your dedication to principles, but I've found that people who insist they never lie are usually the biggest liars of all, even if they're only lying to themselves.
Are you suggesting I am deluding myself, sir?
Not intentionally. But consider this. You've spent your life in one town, surrounded by people largely like yourself. I've traveled the world and seen how different life can be. What seems universal in Königsberg might look mighty provincial in Calcutta or San Francisco.
A fair observation. Yet I would counter that while customs and practices vary, the underlying principles of morality must be universal if they are to be meaningful at all. The forms may change, but the essence remains constant.
I'll meet you halfway there. I believe there are some moral truths that hold across humanity, like the value of friendship that led Huck to help Jim. But your rigid rules? I'm not so sure those are universal.
This friendship you describe, where your character chooses loyalty over the corrupt laws of his society, actually supports my position. It suggests he recognized a universal moral principle that transcends the contingent rules of his time. Yet I wonder, those words you used to depict the racial attitudes of that era, those slurs and vulgarities that caused such controversy after, does the manner in which you conveyed this moral truth also adhere to universal principles? Can one use language some find deeply offensive to illustrate what is proper?
That's exactly it. Sometimes you have to break rules to serve a higher purpose. Huck Finn speaks in vulgar dialect and uses the harsh language of his day because that's truthful to his character and his world. I couldn't have made the same moral point if I'd sanitized the speech or had him talking like a Sunday school teacher. Sometimes the most honest thing an artist can do is depict the world as it truly is, warts and all, including the ugly words that reveal the ugliness of prejudice.
I must disagree, Mr. Twain. The moral law cannot be suspended for artistic purposes, no matter how noble the intent. While I grant that art may illuminate moral truths, it must do so without violating moral principles itself. The ends, however worthy, cannot justify immoral means.
Professor, your dedication to absolute truth reminds me of my old aunt, who refused to serve anything but plain boiled potatoes because spices were deceptive. Admirable conviction. Though I notice the world tends to favor those who add a little seasoning, perhaps that's why the Almighty gave us imagination alongside reason, one to build the rules and the other to figure out when to bend them. I suspect even in Königsberg a little embellishment made life more palatable now and then. What in tarnation is this contraption?
Most peculiar. So thin, yet appears to be made of glass and metal.
Look at this craftsmanship, smooth as river stone. Says here, mobile wireless device, contains telephone, camera, global library access, and computational functions. Seems our host is sharing inventions from the present.
The precision of its construction is remarkable, not a seam or imperfection to be found.
Well, would you look at that, letters appearing on glass with just a touch. You know, my friend Tesla predicted devices exactly like this one. While I was sinking $300,000 into that overcomplicated page compositor with all its mechanical parts, Tesla was telling me, "The future will be electrical, not mechanical." Should have listened to him instead of that printing machine that ruined me financially.
And who was this prescient advisor?
Nikola Tesla. Most brilliant inventor I ever encountered. While I was losing my fortune on mechanical gears and levers, he was already working on wireless energy transmission. This device here, with its invisible communication, is exactly the kind of future he envisioned. No mechanical parts, just energy and signals.
This Tesla sounds like a remarkable intellect, a man who could perceive the underlying principles of nature.
I'd say the lounge should summon Tesla soon. The man was half prophet, half wizard. He told me invisible waves were constantly flowing all around us, carrying energy and information. In my lifetime, I watched communication leap from month-long letter deliveries to instant telegraphs, and Tesla predicted it would go even further. You know, every new communication marvel comes with the same promise, that it will finally bring humanity closer together.
And did it?
Well, we certainly got messages faster, but I can't say we grew any wiser about what we sent. The telegraph spread news quicker, but also rumors and market panics made it easier to talk, not necessarily easier to understand each other.
You touch on something important there. The ability to communicate more efficiently does not guarantee we communicate more truthfully or wisely.
Now you're talking sense. Look at this thing. Probably holds more knowledge than the Library of Alexandria in something smaller than a deck of cards. Now I just imagine it. Modern folks walking around with all human wisdom right in their pockets must have created a veritable paradise by now. No doubt they've eliminated war, cured poverty, banished prejudice, and, miracle of miracles, even politicians have stopped lying. At least that's what would happen if knowledge alone was enough to make us better people.
You suggest that access to knowledge has not transformed society as one might hope?
If there's one constant I've observed in human nature, it's our remarkable ability to ignore useful information when it contradicts what we want to believe. Though something tells me that having the world's wisdom at your fingertips doesn't mean you'll bother to consult it before forming an opinion.
I understand your skepticism. In my time, I observed that many remained in what I called self-imposed immaturity, unwilling to think for themselves despite having the capacity to do so.
Self-imposed immaturity? That's a fine way of putting it. In my experience, most folks would rather be comfortable than correct.
Yet I would argue that with greater knowledge comes greater potential for moral advancement. As reason expands our understanding, we become more capable of recognizing our duties to one another. Education and enlightenment walk hand in hand.
I wish I shared your optimism, Professor, but I've found that human nature stays pretty constant. People will use reason just as readily to justify their prejudices as to overcome them. Give a fool a library, and he'll just find more sophisticated ways to be foolish.
But don't you see? It is precisely because we have reason that we can rise above our natural inclinations. We are not bound merely to act as nature dictates. We can act according to moral principles. That is what distinguishes us as rational beings.
Maybe some can. I've met a few souls who seem to live by principles rather than impulses, but most folks I've known are driven more by self-interest than by your moral principles. They'll find ways to justify whatever they wanted to do anyway. The human talent for self-deception is practically limitless.
That may be how people often behave, but not how they ought to behave. The gap between reality and ideal does not invalidate the ideal. The moral law remains binding even when ignored.
I wonder what people in the future use this for. Probably gossip, arguing with strangers, and looking at pictures of cats.
You have a rather dim view of humanity, Mr. Twain.
Not always. For all my cynicism, I do believe in some ideals worth fighting for. When I saw how America was treating the people of the Philippines during that war, I spoke out against it, even though it wasn't popular. I wrote against imperialism when most were cheering it on. Some principles are worth defending, even when they're inconvenient.
That, Mr. Twain, is precisely what moral autonomy means. To act according to principle rather than expedience or popular opinion. To recognize the inherent dignity in all human beings, regardless of their nation or race. Perhaps we are not so far apart after all.
Maybe not, though I suspect I've had more fun testing the limits of your moral laws. I found that a good story, a fine cigar, and convivial company often taught me more about human nature than any philosophical treatise.
I was not without pleasures, Mr. Twain. I enjoyed lively dinner conversations with friends. My table was known for good food, good wine, and stimulating discussion. I was even known to tell jokes during my lectures.
You? A joker? Now that I would have paid to see.
Indeed, students often found my lectures entertaining as well as enlightening. One need not choose between intellectual rigor and enjoyment. The stereotype of the Tao philosopher is largely inaccurate, at least in my case.
I wonder what folks in the future think of us, now that they have devices like this to learn about history. Our ideas must have survived somehow, or we wouldn't be here in this curious lounge, though I wonder if they remember more of my quips than my actual arguments.
An intriguing point. While I believe we should act rightly regardless of recognition, I admit to curiosity about how posterity has interpreted my work. Have they found value in the categorical imperative, or merely preserved it as a historical curiosity?
I'd like to think something meaningful of us lives on, not just our names, but our ideas, something that helps folks navigate this river of life a little better. Though I suspect they've likely kept my jokes and forgotten half my serious points.
Such as?
Well, I once advised folks to never argue with fools. They'll just drag you down to their level and then beat you with experience. Had audiences roaring with laughter all across America with that one. Though, funny enough, the politicians in attendance never seemed to join in the merriment. Can't imagine why.
There is genuine wisdom in such observations. Behind your colorful language and humor lies insight into human nature. You use wit to reveal truth, much as I use reason.
Well now, I never thought of it quite that way. I just found that sometimes people will listen to a joke when they'd turn away from a sermon.
Funny how your jokes and my logic can end up in the same place. Just different ways of getting people to see clearly. Oh, it seems our time in this curious establishment draws to a close.
All good conversations must end, I suppose. Though I admit this has been more stimulating than most of the lecture tours I gave in my later years. It's been a genuine pleasure and honor to be summoned to this lounge with you, Professor Kant.
The honor and pleasure have been mine as well, Mr. Twain. A most unexpected but valuable encounter.
You know, for a man who never left his hometown, you had a remarkably broad vision. Your categorical imperative, the idea that we should act only according to rules we'd want everyone to follow. There's something decent in that, even if I think it needs some bending now and then.
And for a self-proclaimed cynic, Mr. Twain, you show a remarkable commitment to human dignity and justice. Perhaps the difference between us is not so much in our values as in our expressions of them. If I may ask one final question, what do you consider your greatest contribution to humanity?
I'd like to think I help people see the humor in their own hypocrisies. Laughter can deflate pretension better than any philosophical argument. Sometimes people need to be entertained into the truth, rather than lectured into it. And you, Professor?
I sought to establish that human beings are ends in themselves, never merely means. That each person has inherent dignity beyond price or utility. I wanted to demonstrate that morality is not arbitrary, but rooted in reason itself. If those ideas persist, I would be content.
Well, that's something I wouldn't mind being universal law. The notion that every human has inherent worth, that's a mighty fine idea, even if we disagree on how to honor it.
Perhaps in that realm, Mr. Twain, the categories of understanding will finally be complete. Until then, I shall consider our conversation a most valuable anomaly.
If our anomalous conversation proves anything, Professor, it's that understanding isn't about agreeing on everything, but about navigating the river of ideas together, even when the current takes you somewhere unexpected.
Thank you for listening to the Time Capsule Lounge. Back our passion project at patreon.com/Time Capsule Lounge and help us keep summoning the extraordinary for unexpected timeless talks. In an upcoming episode of the Time Capsule Lounge, power meets philosophy in an unexpected encounter. Catherine the Great, the German princess who became Empress of Russia.
But above all, I transformed Russia into European power to be reckoned with.
And Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat whose name became synonymous with political cunning.
The ruler's highest duty is to the welfare of the state. Sometimes that requires uncomfortable compromises.
As the lounge brings these minds together, they explore the practice of statecraft and its risks.
The art lies in knowing the difference between destructive deception and constructive illusion.
A delicate balance indeed.
And despite centuries between them, unexpected chemistry emerges.
Had we met during my time on Russian throne, I might have kept you very close at court. As an advisor, of course.
Your Majesty is too generous.
Power and perception. Catherine the Great meets Niccolò Machiavelli in a timeless conversation about leadership, deception, and the art of rule.